Shalom, my name is Rabbi Josh Caruso of Anshe Chesed, Fairmount Temple. I'm honored to be here today as we pay tribute to our dear Jim. In the words of Ecclesiastes, a season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven. A time for dancing, a time for wailing, a time for birthing, a time for dying. A time for speaking and a time for silence, a time for seeking and a time for losing. The time of mourning is a complicated time filled with many emotions and memories, both bitter and sweet. Begin our service with the recitation of psalms and prayers, thus linking Jim's life with the 3,000-year-old tradition of the people Israel and the eternity of God. I invite you to join with me in the recitation of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guideth me in straight paths for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Take this time now, and we recognize the many who are here whose lives were touched by Jim. And those lives are represented today. So many of you could share your own experiences, your narratives, how Jim influenced and inspired you. If we only had hours and hours, each one of you could submit your own testimony to what he meant to you. We have speakers today who will hopefully lift up some of those reflections and memories, those who are family and friends. In this order, I'd like to invite Sue Newman first, a lifelong friend of Jim, Loie Goldwasser, Jim's sister, Ted Cowan, Jim's son, and Andy Goldwasser, Jim's nephew. Sue?
Dear Jimmy, you've been special in my life ever since I was 15, when you at 23 were the big brother that I had always wanted. You were kind, put up with me, and I looked up to you and treasured the advice you gave me back then. Who knew that 55 years later we would be best of friends who shared our lives, our thoughts, our families, our words. We enjoyed many conversations and spent time together, taking walks in the woods, petting your black lab of the moment, playing golf, or just laughing, and we treasured what we had. You are a man of words, although you didn't often share your feelings unless prodded a bit. But your words and feelings came out in the cards you sent to the people you loved, the beautiful stories you wrote for your grandkids, and your numerous short stories, which I had the privilege to read and edit. Your many friends saw the twinkle in your eye, your generosity, your wisdom and creativity, and your wonderful sense of humor. Thank you, Jimmy, for the honor of being your close friend, for the joy you've brought me, for being my rock during difficult times, and for sharing yourself with me. I know you didn't do that lightly or easily, and I appreciate you letting me see your inner beauty. I will shed many tears along with the others who loved you, and I will miss you greatly, but you will always be with me in my heart.
I'm done. Susan said it all. So I'm going to have to take you on a journey. And those of you who know Jimmy and me, you know that we came from a family of dinosaurs. We grew up during the Golden Age. And one of the most fun things we did every night after dinner, when we weren't out playing baseball or basketball or whatever we were playing, was to go into the living room. I would play the piano, we would sing as a family, and we would dance. And one of the favorite songs that we used to sing and dance to was Side by Side. Do any of you remember that? Oh, we ain't got a barrel of money. Maybe we're ragged and funny, but we've traveled along singing a song, side by side. That is the sum of our brother-sister relationship. From the moment that Jimmy was born, I was in love. He was a darling replica of our dad with these big brown eyes, although my dad had blue eyes, so they came from somewhere else. But I was attached to him as a big sister and was attached to him all my life. The one thing he had that I didn't have was a serious demeanor, a determined demeanor. I couldn't wait until he walked and talked so I'd have a real companion, not just have to change his diapers. He walked on all fours until he was after 2, so I waited. He didn't talk until he was after 3, so I waited. There were interminable tests to see if he was okay, but the doctors determined that he was only stubborn. He would do what he wanted to do when he wanted to do it. So you know where that determination came from. But when the words finally tumbled out, they kept on coming. He became one of the greatest schmoozers. He loved the ideology of the English language, and he would regale anyone who would listen as to the root of this and the root of that, and share his knowledge of everything that he wanted to talk about. He read voraciously. We came from a family that were great readers and great literalists. He loved the classics. He loved books about nature and art, and wrote books and stories, as Susan pointed out. But I was shocked because he had never read anything but comics until he was 8. Side by side, we shared a magical childhood. We always talked how blessed we had been to have had parents who'd inspired and respected us and encouraged us to be good community contributors. And for those of you who know Jimmy, you know what a good community contributor he was. We grew up as Beechwood pioneers, building the community with the Cowans' blood, sweat, and tears, Jimmy even becoming director of recreation at one time. Side by side, Jimmy and I and our 2 boxers, Belinda Hindelinda and Pygnacious Pygmalion Cowan, otherwise known as Piggy, roamed the woods and fields of rural Beechwood as children of the forest. The mold was set. Nature, dogs, laughter, books, songs, words. Each summer, we traveled a long journey by car to a far-flung camp in Canada, fueling our lifelong love to be in the remote areas of the woods. As we became adults, Jimmy ventured even further, canoeing to even more remote areas, hiking and camping, and continuing to feed his soul in nature's arms. And in the lodge at that camp, night sky sparkling like inky water, and loons echoing on the glassy lake, we danced while Jimmy played the accordion, and we sang together, side by side. Whether playing baseball, football, basketball, or sitting at tables filled with family and friends, our home was home base. And Jimmy and I were nestled and molded by what was important in life. And as I look out here, it was you that was important in his life. As condolences come in, and as I talk to all of you, you have stories that you would like to share, and we can't wait to hear them, to keep Jimmy's memory alive. And you will appreciate where the essence of Jimmy began. His core was strong. His friendships deep and unbreakable. Once in his heart, you would always be there, side by side. In a lifetime of 78 years together, there are more stories to tell. My brother, the one who, when he was 3 years old, stepped through 4 panes of glass and badly cut his leg, never cried. I had to do that for him. My brother, the one who cracked his head open on our ceiling during one of his basketball moves, sprinting up the stairs, and bled profusely to his room and slammed the door. I cried for him. He didn't like to show chinks in his armor, but underneath that harder tortoise shell, there was a soft core filled with deep, deep feelings, his strength. My stubborn brother, the Iron Man, the Miracle Man, the witty, charming, handsome man, the wilderness man, the consummate athlete, the lover of art and music, the literary man, the black lab dad, lived the past 13 years because of your friendship, love, and support as he courageously battled pancreatic cancer, 4 heart attacks, C. diff, MRSA, diabetes, lymphoma, strokes, and finally, COVID. You stayed with him side by side through all of this, and especially through the last long 6 months journey of decline. Special mention must be given to his fabulous aide, Raquel, who compassionately attended his needs. To Susan, whose daily calls made Jimmy come alive. And I really am angry with her because I can't tell you the number of times he wouldn't talk to me because he was on the phone with Susan. To Ned Grossman, his longtime friend, who sat with Jimmy almost daily through this past 6 months. The one who would touch his hand, heal his heart, renew old stories, and bring him cookies. To my loving husband, Gary, who has walked with me all these years and was the brother that Jimmy never had. To all of Jimmy's beloved black labs, Arfie, Paddler, Bark, and Cole, who provided lifetime companionship and happiness. To Ted and Jen, our family, and Jimmy's beautiful, exceptional, talented, loving children who never gave up hope and never, never wavered in their love. Without Jen's ministrations, Jim would never have been afforded the care and dignity he received. To all of you, thank you for loving Jim and loving us with your support. These are words that Jimmy would have said when the great Victorian writer Tennyson lost his best friend prematurely at the age of 22. He wrote an elegy that said, "It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved." I will always miss my baby brother. It was a life's journey together, worth walking together again, side by side.
I'm good. For a man who loved his dogs, he sure had some things in common with cats. We never thought he was going to run out of lives. Years ago when he was sick, my Uncle Gary gave me a call. He said, "Teddy, get your papers. Book a flight. Get to Cleveland. Your dad's not well. Probably won't be here when you get in. If he is, quality of life, not so good." So that night, when Greg picked me up from the airport and took me to Hillcrest, we were surprised when we heard laughter coming out of his hospital room. We walk in, my dad's sitting up in his bed, flirting with a nurse. This was not expected. And the flirting, anytime he had a penchant for doing this, and anytime he did, my sister and I would feel so awkward. Now, that was 13 years ago. He had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, weeks to live, and then on the 18th of December, 2008, he had surgery with the only surgeon north, south, east, west of the Cuyahoga River that would operate on him. Afterwards, this surgeon, this amazingly brave man, who I so respect, sat down with me privately and said, "You know, your dad's going to die. I just want to give him hope." But our dad did not die that day, that week, that month. Despite, you just heard the list, right? I mean, in a very condensed period of time, the MRSA, the C. diff, several heart attacks. There wasn't any chemo. There was not any radiation. And no prayers ever crossed his lips. He was too stubborn. And besides, he knew he had a cadre of Catholics working their rosary beads in his support. He appreciated all the prayers, though, all the prayers. But when Greg picked me up this past Saturday night, the ending was different, one that we all expected given the suffering that he had endured. So as a son, I ask you, or I ask in general, how do I take the measure of this man? I used to tell students that some things are too close to the heart to speak about, to write about, so I'm going to try. And I wrote these comments down after I saw him that final time Saturday night. For a guy who liked to play the part of a stoic, he never ignored a phone call, especially by Sue. We had great timing. A lunch date, or an opportunity to chat with anyone and everyone that we would meet on our adventures. We'd come off the trail, I'd be tired and weary, he'd bounce into somebody, and boom, there'd be a conversation when I just wanted to hit and get cleaned up and get some food. He could be a chatterbox. And he was also a romantic, not in the sense of how we think about it, but more in the sense of, as Loie alluded to, the literary sense, with the individual against the sublime. But speaking of romance, did you know that he wrote a novel that he never had published, and it was a romance novel. My dad wrote a romance novel, right? That really threw us when he sent that to us, right? But I was so proud of him for sitting down and writing. So how do I take the measure of this man? Do I count the hundreds of Canadian lakes we paddled, and all the nights we fell asleep in a tent with a wet dog, the loons calling off in the distance? Or recall the experience of finding an island, again, on some remote wilderness lake, filled with blueberries, perfectly timed. We ran around that island, dancing, giggling, stuffing our mouths full of blueberries. Or perhaps it was the unforgettable 3-mile portage on that very same trip. My dad loaded up his Duluth pack in the front. Of course, he was wearing his crisp white pants, a red shirt that he had for years, Duluth pack in the front. He hoisted his canoe onto his shoulders, and then with swarms of black flies, dare flies, mosquitoes biting him, furrowed his brow, stiffened his jaw, never wavered, walked through uneven ground on that Canadian shield for 3 miles. I was miserable. Like, what did I get myself into? It was all I could do to keep up. And that's a feat that I've never been able, despite all my adventures, to replicate. Or was it the Arctic rivers that we paddled, with their white-capped rapids that we raced through as a team? Or the hikes? All those trails we walked in the hardwood forests and fields of Ohio. Perhaps I could take stock through the books this man shared. The first hike we took before we were a family, he had us role play a scene from James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans. He and I wandered the woods looking for the 2 fair maidens, as played by my mother and my sister. That was our first hike. I was 7. He had my attention, and he had it ever since. He filled the head of a young boy with dreams and aspirations, not just to pursue adventures worthy of any romantic, but to tether such pursuits to a larger purpose, and that was to do good in the world. For he believed in service, and he believed in the public good. So how do I take measure of this man? Is it through the commitment to civic involvement he learned through his mother and father, and the burning desire he had to achieve some good? Perhaps it's through the students he taught at Beechwood, Chagrin, Shaker, and the summer camps he organized. Or perhaps it's through his community, through all of you. Do you have any idea how special this community is? I look out and see friends and family he held dearly for decades, and family and friends that are new. He told me your names. He told me your stories. Through this community, his community, my sister and I have gained so much. So how do I take measure of this man? It's knowing and never forgetting that as children, before our dad came into our lives, we were blessed with a strong, big family and an amazing mother. Yet we needed Dad. And he chose us, 2 Italian Catholic kids. And he adopted us as his own. That is how I take measure of this man. And he finally ran out of lives, but he gave us 13 years longer than we should have had. And he will be missed.
For those of you who don't know, my name is Andy Goldwasser. I'm Jim Cowan's nephew. As the last family member to speak today, I have been instructed to keep my remarks short, to keep my remarks light, to try not to repeat, and don't forget to talk about the visitation. So I'll do my best. For as long as I can remember, my Uncle Jim affectionately called me Uncle Monk, short for Uncle Monkey. To this day, I'm not exactly sure why. Perhaps it was because I liked to climb trees when I was a kid, or perhaps it's because he actually thought I was a monkey. What I do know is that after 50 years of my uncle calling me a monkey, it probably wasn't a good idea to have me pick out the place where we're going to have visitation, and it probably wasn't a good idea to have me say a few words at his funeral. Regarding visitation, many of you know that Jim hated malls, especially around Christmas time. So you'll love this. Guess where we're having visitation? Visitation will be held at the out-of-business piano store in the middle of Eaton Mall, directly across from Santa's sleigh, from 2:30 to 5 today. We hope you can stop by for some eggnog. We hope you can relegate about the irony of the setting. Turning to some closing remarks. And Mom, please don't worry. You need not worry, Ted. You need not worry, Jen. You know how much I loved Uncle Jim, and I promise I will not share any family secrets. Uncle Monk, however, will begin with a bit of a good-natured story that I think Jen, Ted, and my brother Brian will appreciate. As you heard, and as many of you know, Jim was the proud son of Les and Connie Cowan, my grandparents. He grew up in a modest two-story home on a double lot in Beechwood with my mom and their two dogs, Piggy and Belinda, who you just heard about. My grandma Connie enjoyed watching Jim and Loie play in the yard while sitting in a lawn chair, drinking a beer, eating a not so well-cooked meal. My grandfather, he enjoyed trying to keep the rabbits out of the garden. It was an idyllic home filled with love, sports, friends, and family. When we were young, meaning the grandkids, we would often sleep at Grandma and Grandpa's house. The grandkids were delegated to the room up the stairs to the left above the garage. It was always colder in that room, and it was a bit dusty, so it was difficult to sleep. In fact, we were convinced that the only time that room was used was when the grandkids came over. The room consisted of one dresser, which Lisa and I happen to have in our house, two single beds, and two paintings that hung on the wall. These were the kind of paintings that you couldn't hang anywhere other than a room over the garage. The paintings consisted of two portraits. One was a portrait of my teenage mother, and the other was a portrait of my teenage uncle. And depending on which bed you selected would depend on where you looked. So if you picked one bed, you'd look directly at my teenage mom, and if you picked the other bed, you'd look directly at Uncle Jim. Well, sure enough, I wasn't going to sleep in the bed that looked directly at Mom, so I had to take the bed that looked directly at my teenage uncle. I was 8 years old, and I was forced to stare into a hand-painted headshot of my teenage Uncle Jim. And as I would lay awake in bed staring at my uncle's face, I did not see the dark, handsome, thin, athletic man with the slightly curly hair that wowed the ladies, some of whom are in this room. I did not see a man who found a way to look good wearing corduroys and a worn-out flannel shirt that went out of style 15 years ago. No, what I saw was the only thing that to this day makes me feel better about the way I looked in my bar mitzvah pictures. I saw a Jewish-looking boy with really curly hair, a boy with an afro that would have made the basketball players in the 1970s jealous. But in all seriousness, as I reflect on that picture and I reflect on that setting, I am reminded of the all-American boy who was blessed to grow up in an all-American home. And then as I fast forward through his life, I think of his incredible kids, my cousins, his loving sister, his loyal brother-in-law, his amazing ex-wife with whom he remained close, his devoted and expansive group of friends and family that are here today. And then I think about his devotion to community, honesty, his integrity, his curiosity, his idiosyncrasies, his writings, his dry wit, his handwritten notes that would always arrive on any birthday or anniversary, his adventures, his hikes, his dogs, his garden, his house in Hudson, his Forerunner with personalized plates that weren't even personalized. I think about all the lives he touched in a positive way and all the little things he enjoyed. And my smile grows larger, my heart grows fonder and warmer, because there is no doubt Ira James Cowan lived a full life and a life well lived. For anybody who'd like to join, the piano store, 2:30 today.
Thank you, Andy. It is a fearful thing to love what death can touch. A fearful thing to love, hope, dream, to be and oh to lose. A thing for fools this, and a holy thing to love. For your life has lived in me, your laugh once lifted me, your word was gift to me. To remember this brings a painful joy. 'Tis a human thing, love, a holy thing, to love what death has touched. In Jewish literature, the Torah is likened to many things. And one of the most profound metaphors illustrated in our liturgy is likening a Torah to a tree. Each Sabbath, as we return the Torah to the ark, the place where it is housed, we sing. Eitz chaim hi lamachazikim ba vetomcheha meushar. I share this with you because Jim Cowan, he didn't study Torah regularly. He didn't attend worship every week. But he was thoroughly an identified Jew. I share this with you because Jim Cowan understood that Torah and Jewish life can be followed and can be lived in many different ways. Living a Torah life requires not only study and prayer, but it demands that we live our lives in an exemplary manner, upholding the universal values to respect, to honor others. The Torah charges us to not separate from our communities, but to improve them. The Torah charges us to be mentors and teachers to those who will one day be caretakers of those very same communities. The Torah commands us to be Shomrei Adamah, to be guardians of this earth. In all these ways, Jim lived a life of Torah. So it seems apropos to think about the Torah as an Eitz Chaim, as a tree of life, its roots firmly anchored to a finely tuned network of generational connectivity. Its branches spreading out like a beautiful prayer shawl that provides shelter and peace, sprouting leaves and fruits that yield goodness aplenty. It is a tree of life. Jim was a tree of life. The roots of Jim's tree of life were bound up with his parents, Les and Connie, of blessed memory. And even though he was born in Cleveland and graduated from the very first high school senior class in Beechwood, Ohio, Jim was a creature of nature. Eitz Chaim. He was a tree of life. He got that from his dad, most probably, who I eulogized nearly 14 years ago. Through family reflections and looking back at my notes from what seems to be eons ago, I shared how Les was adept at puns, how he lived with what was poetically shared to me with a song in his heart. And yes, Loie, when we met, you talked about all the dancing that went on in your home. You told me that he was a man of the soil. We're talking about Leslie here. I remember Jim and Loie telling me, and I quote, "Every child should have a father like this." And how Les always inspired them to be the best you can be. Well, gosh, Ted, our conversation the other day could have been about Leslie, but it was about your dad. The same stuff came up. The sentiments, the same ones were shared. The legacy of athletic success, of intellectual pursuit, of curiosity, and ties to nature. Indeed, the roots run deep for this family. Ted and Loie, you shared with me how you are also connected to nature in deep and profound ways. The family tree and the branches are strong, and the memories are fruitful, and they're very, very sweet. That's not to say that life with Jim was, as you put it, Ted, all rainbows and unicorns. He could be stubborn and difficult and complicated and stoic. Aren't all the great ones? Complicated, complex, it's never simple, and yet, Loie, as you shared, he was both complex and simple. Those are the best people. They don't make it easy for us to truly understand who they are. It's not always convenient. But boy, when we dig in and we invest, it's really something special. I have in my notes, Ted, you shared how your dad talked about reaping the true benefits of life requires difficult pleasure. Difficult pleasure. His pragmatism and focus didn't always allow for other opinions to sway him, but he would always listen. As Ted put it, his relationship with his dad yielded an uncommon friendship with so many walks and hikes with this tremendous tree of life, resulting in deep conversations about anything, about everything. Ted, you always felt heard by him. You felt challenged by him. You felt loved by him. Jen, when I talked to Ted, he said you could share the same stuff, the same feelings. He talked about what Loie called your ministrations towards your dad and what that meant to the greater family. Your unconditional love for him. He touched so many. I share with you some notes from Dave Marsh, an old friend. Dave wrote, Jim was one of my best friends growing up, and our friendship endured over the years. My comments will mostly be from our formative years, so if you see this as a digression, then you'll excuse me. I'll tell you how good a friend he was, Dave writes. Some 20 years after Beechwood's first basketball victory, we had lost 21 games in a row. Jim was asked to write an article about the win, and he wrote, we were behind 43-42 with 30 seconds left. Greg Shelton stole the ball, passed to Jim, who spotted David Marsh heading toward the basket. Jim passed it to Dave Marsh, breaking toward the basket, who made a left-handed layup to win the game. Dave writes, what I liked best about the description was that he never mentioned I was left-handed and could barely shake hands with my right hand. That's how good and considerate a friend he was. And how could I forget those snowy Cleveland winter days when a bunch of us would make it over to his East Baintree house, shovel off his driveway, strip down to our sweatshirts, and play pickup basketball, highlighted by Bruce Carl's famous hook shot that would inevitably bounce off the rim and rarely go in. One of my favorite stories about Jim and me, Dave writes, occurred when my brother Steve went to a dinner highlighting Cleveland professional sporting stars. Steve happened to see Ernie Kellerman, who played against us when he went to Channel High School? Or Chanel. Ernie later became a star quarterback at Miami University and then an all-pro safety with the Cleveland Browns. Ernie remembered that there was one great athlete he played against at Beechwood. Steve said, maybe it was my brother, Dave Marsh. No, it was Jim Cowan, Ernie replied. My brother loved that story. But somehow I must remember Jim, Dave concludes, running back an interception against Orange High School. It wasn't an exaggeration to say he ran as fast as a gazelle and was equally graceful as a gazelle. His grace was evident as an athlete and even more so as a person. He was so proud of his children, Ted and Jennifer. He spoke of them often. And having just met Jennifer for the first time last month, and having talked frequently recently with Ted, I can see why. Jim was a civic leader for Shaker and Chagrin schools, serving as a teacher and later in administration. He was, after that, the executive director for 3 big law firms, managing difficult physical moves and a host of administrative duties. Jim was a civic leader in Hudson, and as Ted said, he gathered up these dear friendships that became his village. And of course, Jim loved his dogs, for which he served as a companion to so very many. Jim is survived by many humans, but Cole should be counted among the mourners today. When I was on the phone with Ted was in the house. It was the first time that Cole neighbor, brought Cole to the house. And I could hear in the background Cole's kind of mournful cries, looking for his companion. A very special relationship. Looking for his tree of life. Eitz Chaim Hi. The Torah is a tree of life for those who grasp it, and all who uphold it they are blessed. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. Jim was a tree of life to all who knew him. He would probably say that he was blessed to breathe in life for his 78 years. But those who knew him would say they were doubly blessed, because his ways were ways of pleasantness too. His paths, the paths he traveled upon, ultimately led to peace and wholeness, this mountain of a man. Zichrono livracha. May Jimmy's memory be an enduring blessing. And let us all say, Amen. Invite everyone to take a moment, if you wish, to share some private prayers, maybe to consider the gifts or the piece of the puzzle that Jim brought to your life. When Great Trees Fall, by Maya Angelou. When great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder, lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall in forests, small things recoil into silence, their senses eroded beyond fear. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, sterile. We breathe briefly. Our eyes briefly see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory, suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid and promised walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality bound to them takes leave of us. Our souls, dependent upon their nurture, now shrink, wizened. Our minds, formed and informed by their radiance, fall away. We are not so much maddened as reduced to the unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when great souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly and always irregularly. Spaces fill with a kind of soothing electric vibration, our senses restored never to be the same. They whisper to us, they existed. They existed. We can be and be better, for they existed. I invite you now, as you are able, to rise at your seats for the chanting of El Malei Rachamim, the memorial prayer. El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamsei Menucha Nechuna, Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את נשמת יצחק בן לייזר אברהם וקונסטנס שלחך לעולמו, בגן עדן תהי מנוחתו. אנא בעל הרחמים, הסתירהו בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו, אדוני ונחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר Amen. El Malei Rachamim, exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure to the soul of Ira James Cowan, who has gone to his eternal home. Merciful One, we ask that our loved one find perfect peace in your eternal embrace. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. May he rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. We now turn to the mourner's Kaddish. You know, family members may have the card in your hands. We take this time when we recognize that it is a mitzvah. It is a sacred commandment to say Kaddish for your loved one, even if you have a different faith. He was so proud of his family. He was so proud of his heritage and honoring his Judaism. Today we honor him back. We pay him tribute with these words that have been shared for generations. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei rabbah. Be'alma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei. B'chayechon uvyomechon. Uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael. Ba'galau v'zman kariv v'imru. Amen. Yehei shmei rabbah mevorach le'olam alomeo maya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudisha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata damiran be'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehei shalama rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. May the source of peace and peace to all who mourn, comfort to all who are bereaved. We say together, Amen. And as we come to the conclusion of our service, we share that Jim is survived by his son and his wife, Ted and Tishan Cowan, his daughter and her husband, Jennifer and Bill Sherman, his grandchildren, Jake and Julia, Archer and Piper, and his brother-in-law and sister, Loie and Gary Goldwasser, his nephews, Brian and Andy, and their families, and of course, to the extended family and friends who were like family. We all send you our good wishes and our hopes, as Loie spoke to, that his memory will continue to live on in all of our lives. Amen. So Andy had spoken to visitation much more eloquently than I could. So it is, as a rabbi, I never thought I would say it's across from the sleigh, the Santa sleigh, in the Eaton collection. And hopefully you'll find it is in the vacant piano store. And that's today from 2:30 to 5 p.m.
I'm going to do it again this week. We're having fun. My golf buddy.